So what does the choice of Moynihan and how he was chosen tell us about Bank of America's prospects for the future? Joining us now is Charles Elson. He's the director of the University of Delaware Center for Corporate Governance. Charles, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. So you've said here that this was an unusually public search for a CEO. Did that make Bank of America's task more difficult?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact that that's the search process, they were under a microscope. You could pick up the newspaper and find out exactly where they were and who had turned them down. It was a very unusual search. It felt a little bit like a presidential election as opposed to a CEO search. And I think the process was damaging to the bank, unfortunately.
And what do you think about the board, the fact that there wasn't already some sort of succession plan in place?
Well, you know, I mean, these were unusual times. My concern here was the fact that they didn't go outside. I think that who they ultimately picked came out of the old regime that created the problems that with which we're now grappling.
But did they even have the option
of go outside?
Did they even have the option of going outside though? Because they got turned down.
Well, that's what, in fact, in the end happened. And I think that responsible there, you have to put some of the blame on the board, some of the blame on the government, frankly. The government involvement, I do think, hurt their chances to get someone else in, whether it was the compensation issue or the fear of government involvement in the operation of the bank. A lot of factors came together. The only people who really lost were the shareholders, who lost to begin with when you had this debacle that created this mess. And then, obviously, they seem to lose every time around, whether through government involvement, through a board that has been less than, I think, less than aggressive with the CEO over time, and obviously a falling stock price. It's been a disappointing year, certainly for those invested in Bank of America.
So let's talk about what Moynihan can do, what he needs to do going forward. What do you think is sort of the #1 task ahead of him?
I think he's got to rebuild morale in the institution. I mean, the fact that this institution has been under siege for basically a year, the fact that obviously the employees of the institution have got to be demoralized with the government involvement, with the government investment, with all the controversy swirling around it. He's got to get his team back together, strong and excited about the future. They need to emphasize the positive going forward. It's been a pretty rough year. That being said, it's going to be really hard, I think, for an insider to do that. Simply because he had, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How does anybody do that, I guess, is the question. Whether it's an insider or no, how does he get his team to be a little more positive?
Well, I think getting the government out of the thing is actually a pretty good thing to begin with. I'm glad that they repaid the money. And beyond that, I think it's reinvigorating the employees of the bank to think more about the bank going forward. I think ultimately you've got to think about the bank as a growth institution rather than a retrenchment play. And I think what you've seen to date obviously has been controversy around the bank's investments, controversy around the bank's loans, and things, frankly, with this bank have not been moving forward. They've, obviously been moving in a very different direction. And that's going to be his goal, get people excited about B of A. B of A, for a long time, was a very well-run operation, very cleanly run. The last year, obviously, has been a mess, and hopefully they can get through it.
How much patience do you think investors have with Moynihan in terms of restoring profitability and restoring the growth profile that you're talking about?
I don't think, from what I've heard, that investors are particularly thrilled with this appointment. Again, we started with his name being surfaced. Then we had this very public search outside, and obviously that failed, and you went back to the insider. And I think as a result of that, people aren't particularly enthusiastic about it. If they were enthusiastic about it, he would have been the pick to begin with. And he wasn't. They went outside, and they finally went back to him. And I think that that's going to be kind of problematic.
Charles, I'm curious, too. You talked about the board and sort of not doing the best job in choosing an insider. Do you think the board makeup, for example, needs to change now?
I think this was a board that historically was viewed as very much aligned with the CEO. I think this was a board that didn't give the CEO a lot of pushback for a long time. And for that reason, I think a lot of others have called for a change in that board. You've had some changes. Some new blood has come onto that board. But I think that process needs to be completed, and it needs to be a board that is independent of management and represents the investors of the bank. And I think ultimately that will produce the best results long term. I don't think, historically that board functioned that way. And I think that was part of the problem that we saw here that resulted in this debacle. miracle that resulted in this management change that resulted in Mr. Moynihan becoming CEO. I wish him the best of luck. As an investor in the bank, I hope he does well, and I hope he prospers, and I hope the bank prospers. It's just this last year or so has been very, very difficult for those who invested in this institution.
Charles, I actually want to ask you about a different institution, if I may, if you can speak about it, and that is Citigroup. Our reporter Greg Miles just talking about Vikram Pandit now being under a lot of pressure. Do you think he needs to go for that bank also to be able to move forward?
Well, you know, again, you're in a very weird situation there because the government itself owns a good chunk of the bank. It's the government who's going to decide whether or not, he stays. I think investors, frankly, have very little influence there, given the size of the government stake. The question, too, by the way, is how much did the government influence decision-making at Bank of America, with obviously their involvement there. Did they influence the change in the board? Did they influence the pick of this particular individual to be CEO? Or did their involvement mean that others would not take the job? Vis-a-vis Citibank, got to ask the same question. Frankly, I think it's more in the hands of the government to make this decision than any outside investor, because the government is the 900-pound gorilla. They own a lot of the stock, but as the government, they become basically the primary player, as far as I can tell, in the way that bank operates, which is, from an investor standpoint, concerning.
Well, I mean, that's what I was going to ask you. If that's the case, do you trust the government to choose the right leader for Citigroup? And do you think that indeed Pandit should go?
You know, that's a good question. Do I trust the government? I think the government, frankly, is a very ineffective investor. The private marketplace does a lot better job, I think, at governing private institutions. I don't think the government does. And what they will decide to do about Pandit, I guess, is everyone's guess. Obviously, the bank has got some issues, too. I think this whole attempted stock sale that obviously didn't happen certainly doesn't help him very much. The question is, where does this thing go from here? But that's going to be the government's call. The bigger question for us as investors is, should the government be there at all? Should the government be running any major bank or any major private business? And I think the answer's got to be no, because their goals are political, not economic, and hence the mess we're in.
Charles, we have to leave it there, unfortunately. Charles Elson, University of Delaware Center for Corporate Governance. Charles, thanks so much for joining.